I'm Dr. Tasia White, and you're listening to Things My Boss Never Told Me. Hello, and welcome back to Things My Boss Never Told Me. I am your gracious host, Dr. Tasia White, and I am so glad to be back. So that little hiatus that I took in December that kind of spilled into part of January was definitely much needed in terms of, trying to figure out some other things related to my business as well as to my personal life. And so while I stepped away a little bit longer than I had originally planned, I'm really glad that I did because it all worked out in the end. So I'm glad to be back, and I'm glad that you are back here listening to my podcast. So today's topic is going to be on team essentials, and it will be a two-part conversation because when I was planning for this episode, I realized that there was just a lot of content to cover. And so I decided that rather than trying to make this a 2-hour-long episode, we're just going to separate it into two parts. And so I will talk about the first half in this episode and then the second half in episode number 8. Sounds good? All right, so before we jump into our topic, I wanted to just take a minute to recap some of the themes that we discussed in the first half of season 1, because as we continue into the second half of season 1, we will be revisiting some of the concepts that were previously mentioned. All right, so let's take a quick trip down memory lane. So with episode number 2, we talked about the difference between leaders and managers and how those are two different supervisory styles that have their own unique attributes and characteristics that are necessary for different types of work environments. So for leaders, it's more focused on the people, the relationships, more of the quality of what a person is providing. Whereas on the management side, it's more focused on the tasks, the goals, and making sure that the job is being executed in a particular way. And then in episode number 3, we talked about the difference between transactional and transformative leadership and how they relate to understanding one's motivating factors within the work environment and how understanding that is significant for retention as well as turnover and overall satisfaction within a work environment. And we also drew some connections between transactional leadership and management and transformative leadership and leadership as it was described in the second episode. Then in episode number 4, we switched gears a little bit by talking about a concept that I call mindful leadership and connected that to emotional intelligence, emphasizing the fact that having a high emotional intelligence is a good quality for a leader or manager to have because the tone that they set at the supervisory level will essentially impact their teams and how the work environment flows within the office dynamic. And then in episode number 5, we talked about the importance of understanding and demonstrating one's leadership presence. And the best way to understand what they are is to look at what our values, intentions, and strengths are as it pertains to being a leader, then making sure that we are demonstrating those values, intentions, and strengths consistently when interacting with our teams, and then participating in a cycle where we are consistently assessing the relevance of those strengths, intentions, and values as it pertains to the environments that we're in. And so all of those topics bring us full circle to now understanding team dynamics. And if you haven't noticed, part of what I was doing in the first half of season 1 is essentially setting up the leader as the facilitator of a team, which will be significant as we talk about today's topic. All right, so let's go ahead and jump into it. So, as always, establishing a basis of understanding, we'll start by highlighting what is a team and how does one define a team. So, within this context, I would define a team as a group of people working together towards a common goal. Sounds easy, right? So we just get a group of random people together and we say, hey, this is your goal, work towards this. And then they just suddenly figure it out, right? If only it were that simple. One of the things that I have found is that there needs to be a consistent and solid team dynamic, because that plays such a significant role in how well the team functions and how they're able to get the work done efficiently. And based on my own experience with teams, both being part of a team as well as leading teams, over the years, I have identified 6 key components to establishing a healthy team dynamic. And those 6 components are boundaries, expectations, accountability, collaboration, balance, and compassion. And some of these shouldn't be a surprise to you, right? Because we've talked about them in some capacity, particularly expectations and boundaries, and a little bit on the accountability side. So today's episode, we will focus on those first 3, boundaries, expectations, and accountability. And then in episode number 8, we will continue our conversation by focusing on collaboration, balance, and compassion. So the important thing to mention as we talk about the 6 essential components that I've identified for establishing a healthy team dynamic is that the role of the supervisor is to be a facilitator. So what I am introducing here is something that the leader would be responsible for facilitating intentionally, because teams are not just made. There is a lot of effort put into creating effective teams. And to think that you can just put a bunch of random people together and expect them to just work well without any kind of direction on how to function as a team is just naive. I mean, think about it. With all of the different types of teams that exist, can we really say that those teams were formed organically? Like maybe for some of them, but for most of them, there was some intention behind who does what and how they interact with one another inside and outside of the realm that they're in. Let's step away from work teams for a second and look at sports teams. Think about in the training how much effort is put into developing the team and identifying team captains and their role in facilitating a certain type of team culture. You know, we see that in just about every sport, right? And so how can we think that such a thing would not exist in a work environment? Now, granted, there may be some individuals who feel like, well, you're getting a paycheck, so you're essentially getting paid to get along with your colleagues. However, as we discussed in episode number 3, money isn't always the motivator, nor is it a good motivator. If anything, it will just get people to do the bare minimum. And when you're working in a team, the last thing you want someone to do is the bare minimum. If anything, you want them to be able to look out for each other and to go above and beyond to complete the task at hand. And so if you think that them getting a paycheck should be enough to motivate them to do the job well within that team, you are sadly mistaken. And in fact, I would go as far as to say that the leaders who aren't making the effort to create an effective team are probably dealing with inner team conflicts, rapid turnover, or the quality of the work is probably not that good, which ultimately creates more work for the supervisor anyway. So why not just put a little bit of extra effort into creating a cohesive team instead of holding this assumption that, well, they're getting a paycheck, so they have to get along. This goes back to what I shared again in episode 3 about Maslow's hierarchy of needs. For example, if an individual feels like they're part of something greater, including a great team, they are much more likely to want to continue working with that team and to find a sense of joy and fulfillment in their job and to want to come to work every single day. So why not be just a little bit proactive and taking the steps necessary to establish a team culture that could be facilitated during the onboarding process or intentionally planned throughout the year? Like, there's so many different ways to do this at the beginning so that you don't necessarily have to deal with certain types of conflicts or issues later on. I'm not saying that doing so is going to make it perfect. Like anything else, there are bound to be some bumps in the road, but I think the bumps will be a little bit smaller and far and few between. And ultimately, my hope is that by the end of both of these episodes, you will have a framework for establishing your own team dynamic that works best for your environment, that best fits your goals and what it is that you're trying to accomplish as a team. And so again, the role of the supervisor is to be the facilitator of these components. And just a quick note, I know I keep using the terms supervisor and leader. That is not to exclude my managers out there. If anything, my default word is leader. However, everything that I am discussing applies to both types of supervisors. Okay, so the first component is establishing team boundaries. And the thing to really highlight about team boundaries is understanding that all should have a voice. Everyone should be able to share what is significant to them. They should be able to feel comfortable saying what's on their mind, asking for what they need within the team. And one of the activities that come to mind for establishing this is the 3 flags activity that I shared in episode number 4. And so if you remember, I talked about typically at the beginning of a school year, or if I had a new team that I was working with, I would try to start the year off by doing this 3 flag activity where they identify their red flags, their green flags, and their yellow flags. And so their red flags represent their pet peeves. The yellow flags represent things that maybe they're trying to work on or maybe are sensitive about. And then the green flags are the things that help them to thrive in their work environment. And I would set aside time to talk about that as a team, because not only was it important for me to know, but it was also important for everyone else to know, so that we all knew what buttons not to press and where we could empower and encourage each other as a team. So setting up some kind of boundary that makes it comfortable for each team member to share is important. And so as the leader, you also have to hold yourself accountable to that too. So you can't say this is an open environment and then shush people whenever they say something you don't agree with. If anything, there's an opportunity for a conversation about that particular topic that was mentioned. Sometimes in my case, my teams were a little bit chatty. Like our staff meetings would be probably longer than they needed to be because we were just constantly having conversation. And so there were moments where I would try to move the conversation along only in the interest of time, which I think kind of speaks to the type of team dynamic that we had. We actually enjoyed being around each other, and we had conversations that were mostly relevant to work. I'm not going to lie and say that all of those conversations were relative to work, but I would say 90% of them. And, even though we saw each other on a daily basis, it was still nice for us to really come together as a team to have these great conversations about the topics that were relevant for that week and doing some problem solving. So it's up to you to find that balance. But I think the biggest takeaway for this first component around boundaries is there needs to be some kind of mechanism that lets each team member know that their voice matters and they can express themselves freely in a way that is respectful to the team. All right, so that sums up the first component. The second one is expectations. And to be honest, I was kind of going back and forth about the similarities between the words boundaries and expectations. And the best way that I categorize it as it relates to today's topic, boundaries are more informal, whereas setting expectations is more formal. So for example, in terms of setting boundaries, it's really about the day-to-day team culture, like the things that you just understand is part of the makeup of the group that isn't necessarily formally captured somewhere. So if we know that someone has a pet peeve about something, that isn't necessarily something that we would write as an expectation, right? Instead, it's more of a situation where I understand that this is a pet peeve of so-and-so, and out of respect for them, I'm not going to do that thing. So with setting expectations, it's really meant to be something that is formally captured, that can be revisited on an ongoing basis and can be replicated every time someone new is introduced to the group. With boundaries, it's a little hard to replicate a certain conversation, whereas with expectations, it's really meant to be more concrete. And there's actually a particular model that comes to mind as it relates to having the right framework for setting expectations in a team environment. The model is called the Groupie Model, which is an acronym. And so Grippy being GRPI, and the G stands for goals, the R stands for roles, the P stands for processes, and the I stands for interpersonal relationships. And so the Grippy model was initially introduced by the organizational theorist Richard Beckert back in 1972. And he believed that having this model would help with establishing team cooperation. Now, what I appreciate about this model is how detail-oriented it is. When it comes to setting expectations, it provides us with the framework for where we should be setting those expectations and making sure that we are covering all of our bases. So, for example, in the area of goals, setting expectations around outcome, purpose, and performance. In the area of roles, setting expectations around everyone's responsibilities and who has authority. In terms of processes, setting expectations around how things are executed in terms of a plan and milestones. And then lastly, in terms of interpersonal relationships, setting expectations around how we develop trust and facilitate inter-staff communication. And again, there are components of this that touch on what we discussed previously in terms of boundaries, but it really speaks to the more organizational pieces that aren't always captured in one's position description. And I feel like in any job, there are so many things that are not included in a position description that is an expectation. And so the Grippy model serves as a great framework for making sure we're hitting all of the places where we have certain expectations around how we want things done and when we want things done. And I think what I appreciate most about the Grippy model is its simplicity, despite the fact that it is so detail-oriented. So I will make sure to include a picture of this model on my website in case you wanted to explore this a little bit further. And actually, a little tip that I will share with you that I did was create a team training around the Grippy model. And this was something I actually did right before transitioning to my new role. And so if you remember, at one point I was working in the housing and residential life department. And in preparation for a new team coming in, I decided to redo the training structure to incorporate the Grippy model because I had just learned about it in my doctoral studies and thought it was a very cool concept that really simplified all of the things that we needed to touch on within our training. And so each day I focused on a different letter. So we had a day where we focused on goals, a day where we focused on roles, and etc. And that actually came in handy because that was the year that the transition took place from me supervising that department to my colleague taking over that department. And so when we were making that switch, I was able to give her the blueprint for incorporating her own expectations around each of the components. And she was very grateful for that structure, and I had no idea things were happening that way. So it really all kind of worked out. And so overall, I think the Grippy model is very helpful in terms of setting expectations and knowing which areas to touch on when sharing said expectations with the team. And ideally, if it's a conversation that the team can participate in, that makes it even more helpful. So it's not just you setting the expectations. Maybe you kind of set the tone, but allowing them to also contribute to how these expectations should be met is helpful because it essentially builds accountability, which is our third topic. But one of the things I wanted to point out before we transition to the third component is that the first two are establishing a basis of understanding, which is something that I talk about pretty much in every episode. And so like I shared in episode number 2, we have to make sure we're all on the same page, especially starting out, because that just makes it that much easier going forward. And so starting with establishing boundaries and setting expectations are crucial for creating a cohesive team. Okay, so we have boundaries and expectations as the first two components. The third one and the final one that we will be discussing in this episode is accountability. And I would actually say specifically mutual accountability, because at the end of the day, accountability has many forms, right? In terms of employee-employer relationships, there's a certain level of accountability that already exists. However, what I have found to be the most powerful form of accountability is mutual accountability or team accountability. Multiple individuals who are holding each other accountable in various ways. And it's balanced in a way that no one feels that there's any kind of power dynamic between them. Everyone understands that they each have a role and they're each responsible for holding each other responsible to those roles, right? And mutual accountability can develop organically, but it does require a little bit of facilitation. And there's actually a process that I learned when I was doing my master's that I feel kind of helps with developing mutual accountability within teams. And so, as I mentioned previously, I read a lot of Harvard Business Review articles because one of my professors, that was his main source for sharing information with us. And actually, this one article was one that I did read for his class. So it all comes together. But the article was on a term called fair process. And fair process is essentially a 3-step process of trying to get one's team to buy into whatever changes that need to take place. And so the first step is explaining what the change is or what the situation is. The second step is providing an outlet for those involved to express themselves, to share any concerns or ideas that they may have. And then the third step is coming up with a clear set of expectations going forward. And the cool thing about this process is that too often when trying to implement any kind of change, managers or leaders can skip over the second part, which is to provide an outlet for discussion and for them to share their ideas or concerns. And so what tends to happen is a change needs to be made, and then there's just this new policy or this thing that is now expected of those who have to carry it out. And the part that's so important about the second step is that the individuals who have to actually execute this new thing are sort of left scratching their heads wondering, where is this coming from? Why is this happening? And it may be a situation where they feel left out of the loop, blindsided by it, or they're feeling like this is something that they're being forced to do. And so there's just all of these negative feelings that can brew around this new thing, whether it's beneficial to them or not. Just the fact that it is some kind of change can cause anxiety within an individual. And so the fact that you're skipping over the part where they get to express their concerns or whatever feelings they may have about the change is the difference between them accepting it and them resisting it. And skipping over one's feelings is ultimately not conducive to establishing trust within a team. As much as we may want to resist going down the rabbit hole of having people vent and it become unproductive, like there are ways to keep the conversation productive without losing the main points or without creating a cloud of negativity. But skipping over that is just going to cause that kind of negativity to linger and ultimately seep into the work that they're doing. And whether you're present or not, they're going to have those conversations. So why not bring it out into the open so that you can be part of those conversations and understand where their concerns are coming from and what they're saying and be more proactive in terms of addressing it versus hearing the gossip about it later. So while that second step may seem like more work than it's worth, it's not. It is very much worth it. And you will thank yourself in the long run. And what the authors of this article suggested is that if you provide them with that outlet, whether or not you take their advice, but just providing them with that outlet increases the likelihood of them following through on that change. And when I first read that in graduate school, I was like, sounds interesting. Like, I'm not really sure how that works, but okay. And then I tried it. It was a situation where we were making a change to our recruitment process. Like we were adding something new where applicants would shadow staff members. And my team was resistant to it. And they had all of these concerns about how it could go wrong and all these things. And so my colleagues and I were like, all right, well, let's talk about that. Like, what are the things that you anticipate? And they actually had some really good ideas in terms of like what they were concerned about. And that gave us an opportunity to be proactive for addressing that before we actually implemented the process. And so we took in their advice. And then a week or so later, we said, okay, we appreciate that conversation, but we're still going to go through with this process. And here are the guidelines for who would shadow whom and formalizing it. So it wasn't just a situation where an individual was essentially shadowing one of their friends. Like I wanted it to be an actual learning process for them, as opposed to just hanging out, chit-chatting. Like I wanted it to be some facilitated conversation, and we provided them with like questions and things to pose to the applicants. In the event that there was some downtime or if they were looking for something to do, we gave them a list of suggested activities so that the applicants really got a sense for what the job entailed. So that was the new part that we were implementing. And by the time we completed our recruitment process, the team members who were directly involved in the execution of that new process were so excited and so grateful that they were part of it. And in reverse, those who were not directly involved were sad and disappointed that they didn't have a chance to participate because they had heard from their colleagues how great it was. And we were not strategic about who would be involved and who wasn't. It was just a matter of how the schedule worked out when we were doing our recruitment process. So we did not intentionally select those who were pro the change and exclude those who were against the change. We had a mix of both who were directly involved in this new process. And it was funny because I remember there was one individual who specifically was like, no, this process couldn't work. Like, what about this? What about that? Just very vocal about how it could all go wrong. And then once we concluded our recruitment process, they sent me an email saying that they had heard such wonderful things and they had wished that they were part of it. And again, we did not intentionally exclude that individual. It just kind of worked out in terms of when they were scheduled. But to me, that was just an affirming moment. Yes, they initially had their concerns, But once we took into account what those concerns were, and they saw that we made the effort to at least listen to them and even make some adjustments where we saw appropriate, like there were some things that they wanted to change and we were like, no, we're not going to do that, but we will do this. And it still worked out in the end. Ultimately, it set us up to continue to enhance the program. And by the next year, it was just adopted as the norm. And so within the context of establishing a cohesive team environment, I share all of that to say, once we get past that initial implementation, what I found is that everyone else will hold each other accountable to make sure the process is getting done accurately. And so in the example of the new recruitment process, within that first week of implementing that process, more of my staff members were present when the applicants were around, even if they didn't necessarily need to be. So every building had a person on call for each evening. And so the applicants would shadow my staff members while they were on call for the evening. And what I found is that for the staff members who were not on call, who were not required to work, they would come and interact with the applicants too. And they would actually assist the person who was on call in terms of making sure that, everyone was accounted for, making sure that everyone was engaged and just participating, and ultimately making sure that the applicants are getting a lot out of the experience. And there were some instances where, let's say, someone who was on call didn't follow a particular protocol. The person who wasn't on call would step in and make sure that the applicants got the correct information, or step in the event that the person on call needed to respond to an emergency. And so it was kind of a cool dynamic to see developing in the moment, where initially they were completely against it. Like I would say 90% of the staff was against adding shadowing to the application process. And yet that 90% very quickly changed their perspective and realized the value of what we were trying to do, and did their part to hold others accountable, making sure that all of our ducks were in a row and making sure that the process was run smoothly. I just thought that was such a cool thing to see in real time. And there have been other times when I've used fair process, but in each and every scenario, I've just been in awe of the amount of mutual accountability that is established by having team members involved, or at the very least, sharing their input as it relates to team essentials. And I kind of alluded to this a little bit earlier. When it comes to setting boundaries and expectations, while you as a supervisor may have your own boundaries and expectations, engaging your team in that conversation makes it even more likely that they will honor and respect those expectations that you set forth. And it becomes even more significant when they know that their fellow team members have also contributed to said expectations. And again, even if you don't necessarily agree or want to add those to the structure, they're still likely to follow through on whatever expectations and boundaries are set, because it was at least a conversation that they felt like they were able to contribute in some way. Even if that contribution wasn't necessarily taken into account, there's still an attachment to it. And because of that attachment, they're more likely to also make sure that everyone else is following the same protocol. It's just a really cool thing to watch happen. So if you think this is something that you would be interested in doing, I highly recommend looking into the FAIR process method. And I will include the article on my website if you want to check it out. It was in the Harvard Business Review Top 10 Must-Reads on How to Manage Others. Although the authors didn't necessarily talk about accountability, that's still something that I recognize in terms of my own implementation of this process. So when you do it, you may find your own observations. And if you do, please share them with me. I would definitely love to hear from you. But ultimately, it's very helpful for establishing a cohesive team environment. And so similar to the 3 steps that are part of the FAIR process method, the development of accountability starts with 1, sharing your own boundaries and expectations, like we talked about previously. 2, providing your team an opportunity to do the same. And you as a supervisor ultimately deciding, particularly as it relates to the expectations piece, because for boundaries that may differ for different people. And as long as, their boundaries are not a hindrance to their job, leaving that to them should be left up to them. But in terms of the expectations, like that formal document that's revisited on an ongoing basis, once those expectations have been established and discussed within the team, it is our job to provide the final draft, so to speak, of said expectations for everyone to follow going forward. So a good example of how to balance like your expectations and the team's expectations comes from an activity I actually learned from one of my mentors back in undergrad. So what she did was provide this document, which was split into 2. So on one side of the document, she listed her expectations of the group. And on the other side, she listed what the group can expect from her. And I thought that was really cool. And I think I might have referenced this a little bit in episode number 5. So this may sound familiar. And one of the things that I did was slightly modify that by actually adding a section for my team to also share what expectations that they wanted to add. And so in the initial document, I had some blank lines at the bottom for each side. And so I started with going through the list of, what I expected of them. And then I asked them, is there anything that you feel is missing? Is there anything that you don't agree with? And then use that bottom section as an opportunity for us to write out what those things were. And then in terms of what they can expect from me, again, after going through the list, providing a space for them to share with me what they expect of me as their leader. And again, it was just an opportunity for all of us to hold each other accountable to this list of expectations. And there was just a certain level of unity that came from doing that activity. So I highly recommend at least considering doing some form of that, however it best fits in your current organizational structure, right? And something that doesn't necessarily require a lot of time and effort. Like when I did it, we were usually going through our operational manual. And so that particular activity maybe took 10 to 15 minutes max. And so anything beyond that, I think you may be going a little too far, because it's really meant to just hear the team members out and maybe make some minor modifications. But ultimately, you're deciding as the leader what those expectations are beforehand. And upon doing so, the second step, sharing said expectations with your team and giving them an opportunity to grapple with it a little. And ideally, having them agree to it at the end. So again, not something that should require a lot of time and effort. Okay, so earlier I shared an example of how mutual accountability was helpful in terms of starting a new process, right? And I wanted to give you another example of how I saw mutual accountability be helpful in a group setting. So this was a situation where I was advising a group of students who were part of a student organization. And we had already established what the expectations were as a group. For me, I just found it to be consistent no matter which group I was interacting with, whether it was with the people that I was supervising or the people that I was advising. I took the time to demonstrate my expectations and allow them to do the same. And so as I shared a minute ago, participating in that kind of activity with all of the groups that I was starting to connect with. So there was one situation where a couple of the executive board members of this organization did not always get along. Like some of them had very different opinions about certain things and how things should be run. And so that created a little bit of friction within the group on occasion, like when deciding how to proceed with a particular idea or project. And something like that is natural, right? Even with mutual accountability, even with going through the process of getting everyone on the same page, everyone is going to have their own opinions, which is totally valid. And honestly, that's what we should be seeking, right? We don't want to be stuck in a situation of groupthink. We want to be in a situation where everyone feels like they can contribute their own personal perspective. And so that was the case with this group that I was advising. And at some point when they were having their meeting, the conversation escalated into an argument instead of just a conversation. And each of them went back and forth and said their piece, and some other things kind of came up that were not helpful to the conversation. And so some feelings were hurt and things like that. But when the arguing stopped, one of them immediately said aloud, "Tasia's going to be very disappointed in us." And it's not the first time that I've actually had either people that I was supervising or advising say something like that, where specifically if there was an argument that took place and it made them look unprofessional, someone within the team said, "Tasia's going to be disappointed in us." And the rest of them would be like, "Yeah, she is." And I share that story to say that while it was good for them to understand that I expected them to be professional, I appreciated that I didn't have to say that I'm disappointed in them. One of them identified it as something that they would have to face at some point when they told me what happened. And I think I shared in episode number 4 about the situation with 2 of my staff members and how 2 of them got into an argument and, it didn't end well. And that's how I learned not to pair those 2 individuals together anymore. That was another situation where the third person involved said, "Tasia's going to be disappointed in us." And they knew the next day when they came into my office, once I learned of what happened, that they were going to have to deal with it. And we're going to have a very stern conversation about what happened and why that happened and how we can do better in the future. And so for me, it just reinforces the idea that mutual accountability is so powerful. Like, I didn't have to say that I was disappointed in them. It was just a matter of, all right, so how do we move past this? How do we deal with this? What do we need to do better? And I think that is a much better position to be in as the supervisor, because when it comes to reprimanding individuals, no one ever really wants to be seen as the bad guy, right? At least I don't. Like, as much as I am stern about my expectations and what I think is and is not appropriate, at the end of the day, like, I don't like having to reprimand people. And so the fact that they sort of reprimanded themselves by speaking to each other within the team, Tasia's going to be disappointed in us versus Tasia's going to be disappointed in you, or me saying I'm disappointed in you. Like, I feel like that just completely changes the conversation. And so if anything, it allowed me to enter the conversation with the standpoint of, all right, so this happened. And this is what we need to do to resolve it. And this is what we need to do to move forward and avoid this in the future. So I think that's one of the crucial benefits to establishing team accountability, because it sort of takes a little bit of the pressure off of you to be the enforcer, and it empowers everyone else within the team to reinforce each other. So making sure that no one feels like they are the enforcer within the team, because that would be inappropriate, but kind of reinforcing or reminding each other of like, hey, like, this isn't cool and we should do better and we know better. So if nothing else, I think mutual accountability is helpful in those types of scenarios. So just to recap, today we focus on the first 3 components of what I have identified as team essentials. The first one being setting boundaries, where we spend some time understanding how we can best get along with one another. The second being setting expectations, which would be some kind of formal document, ideally, that demonstrates the expectations that have been set for the team. And all members of the team, including us as supervisors, should be contributing to said expectations. And if anything, the expectations should start with the supervisor, and the other team members should have an opportunity to contribute to the conversation, which then creates the opportunity for the third component that we discussed today, which is team accountability or mutual accountability. And with team accountability, there needs to be that process of, one, identifying what the situation is, whether it be a change or even just establishing a new set of expectations. Two, having some kind of discussion on those changes within the team so that everyone feels like they were able to equally contribute to the conversation. And then three, as the supervisor, sharing with the team what those expectations are going forward so that everyone is on the same page. And in doing so, the team members are more likely to, one, adhere to set expectations because they felt like they had a hand in contributing to it. And two, they are also much more likely to hold each other accountable to set expectations, which then takes a little bit of the pressure off of us, the supervisors, to have to hold them accountable to what was said. So ultimately, there are a lot of benefits to these first three components. And so, as always, we will begin to transition to my gratitude list. So first, I am grateful for the amazing teams that I have supervised and advised. I have truly had some really, really great teams. And when I think about our relationships that in some cases still continue, even after I haven't supervised them, for many of us, we are still very connected. And I just love that. It just makes me appreciate them and who they are and how much they were pivotal in me sharing the concepts in today's episode. So thank you to all of you. Second, I am grateful for the insight I have gleaned over the years related to team dynamics. When I think about teams, like going all the way back to the first team that I was a part of in college, I realized that I really didn't have an appreciation for the amount of effort that was put into just the formation of said team. And now that I've been a part of multiple teams and supervised my own teams, I recognize that there is so much that goes into creating a cohesive team. And I'm glad that over the years, I've acquired the knowledge and tools to be able to establish my own effective team with a little less drama and a little more ingenuity. Sometimes we have to be in the center of things to really appreciate them. So I'm definitely grateful for the knowledge I've gained along the years. And then last but not least, I am grateful for my college mentor, Stacy, who introduced this idea of having expectations of the team as well as what they can expect of the person supervising them. And in her case, she was technically advising us. And so I adapted what she had shared to fit my needs, but literally doing that in my very first job in higher education saved me so much time and effort into developing the team. Like when I first started at this job, I had one set of individuals who I was supervising, and by the end of that year, I felt like it was a disaster, like things fell apart. And then I revisited the document that Stacy had shared with me when I was a student of hers. And that next year, once I implemented that, oh my gosh, that team, it was really great. Like it was really, really great. Probably one of my best teams, to be completely honest. But nonetheless, thanks to Stacy, I was able to use that activity to help establish that team. So thank you, Stacy. Okay, and so now we will transition to our affirmation. So today's affirmation is, I am a strong team facilitator who is adept at setting expectations, boundaries, and accountability within my team. And I think it's important for us to recognize that, like, it does require a certain person who's willing to take on that effort of implementing all of the things that I shared in today's episode. And so if this is something that you are already doing, or if this is something that you plan to do, you need to be recognized for being great and having the strength to do this, or even having a desire to do this. Because again, not everyone is willing to put in that effort. I think for many of the individuals, as I shared at the very beginning of this episode, they don't want to put in that effort. And so that creates more work for them later on. And so just being willing and able to implement these ideas takes a lot. So make sure you commend yourself on that. Okay? All right, so that wraps up today's episode. I am looking forward to us continuing the conversation. I hope that you are excited for it in episode number 8, where we will be discussing the second half of the 6 components of team dynamics: collaboration, balance, and compassion. And I think once we continue the conversation, we'll bring everything full circle. So, sounds good? All right. Thank you so much for listening, and have a great day. Thank you so much for listening to this episode of Things My Boss Never Told Me. Before you go, please make sure that you like and subscribe down below. Also, I included a few recommended videos for you to check out. Thank me later.